Hi, it's Mark from Remarkable Speaking. I'm here with Wil Seto of Insync Physio in Vancouver, one of Vancouver's best pair of physiotherapy clinics. And we're going to talk about rotator cuff tears from rock climbing. This sounds really sore and hurting already, Wil.
Yeah, so what is a rotator cuff tear? So first of all, your rotator cuff, there's four tendons and muscles that make up what's called your rotator cuff in your shoulder. And there's one on the front, that's called your subscapularis. They basically attach from your shoulder blade all onto your humerus, which is basically the bone of your arm. And subscapularis is the one in the front. And then you have one on the top called your supraspinatus. So that's one of the major ones as well. And then your other two, which is in the posterior part or the back part of the shoulder blade, which is basically your infraspinatus and your teres major. So those are the four that make up your rotator cuff muscles. Now, essentially, when we look at which one usually tends to get injured, it's typically your supraspinatus or your infraspinatus and your teres major. Sorry, I said teres major before. I meant teres minor. Teres minor is the fourth rotator cuff. So the teres minor and the infraspinatus are the two posterior ones that attach on the back of the shoulder blade. And the one that attaches on the top is the supraspinatus. Those are the ones that tend to be more prone. Now, the reason why is because they tend to be the ones that get compromised in a few different ways. So you can either have an acute tear, which means like it's, basically a traumatic thing can happen. You can fall on your shoulder and then all suddenly tear it and strain it. Or you can have something that's kind of more of like a chronic sort of overuse thing that happens over time. I previously talked a little bit about shoulder impingement, how to distinguish between that and a rotator cuff tear. There's certain tests that we do to figure out if it's one or the other. But essentially, when you're looking at the more chronic aspect of a rotator cuff, it's sort of like that slow, boil. It's kind of like the frog in the hot water. You've done something like as soon as you go into the hot water, it's hot. Something's happened. That's like the acute tear. Whereas like, you kind of keep training and you go to the gym or going into the climbing crag outside, 3 days a week or whatever you're doing. And you start to just get a little bit tighter. You start to notice it and may not be doing any stretching or any mobility work. And then you just like suddenly you just wake up one morning and just feels a little bit more sore. And then now you start to get a bit of that impingement stuff. So it can present like an impingement type of pain for sure. But then there's certain tests that we can determine whether or not that pain that you're getting is a result of like maybe something going on more sinister like in the rotator cuff, like a tear. And ultimately, we can only assess in probabilities, based on our clinical experience that, you look at certain tests that can help you sort of determine whether it is or it isn't. But ultimately, the better standard is getting some scans, and that'll give you some more information. But rehab is actually very good for even rotator cuff tears.
And what does the rehab actually consist of?
If it's an acute sort of tear, then we want to obviously address any of the acute inflammation or anything like that that's happened like initially. And then as it kind of moves past to like, as it starts to heal, we always want to consider what's that healing time frame, right? For any kind of soft tissue, but then particularly when you look at a rotator cuff injury tear, it's going to be a little bit longer. So typically you're looking at anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks as sort of a minor tear. And even something that's more moderate, it can fully heal and it does really well with rehab and physiotherapy. So there's a lot of good studies out there that show that. And our clinical experience, we've had a lot of good results with that. And so essentially, when we treat it, we want to also treat the acute aspect of it and looking at starting to like build the strength back up into that injured rotator cuff, that tear. But then we also need to address a lot of what's going on in the muscle imbalances, particularly in the shoulder blade. So if it was more of an impingement type of issue where it's chronic and it kind of led up to more, like this last straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing, then we want to start look at, well, why did this happen? And usually there is a lot of that kind of stuff going on, with climbing where there's imbalances. And so we need to address those at the same time, because if you don't, then you're not really able to address the proper mechanics of what you want to have occur in the shoulder joint as you start to rehab the actual tear, because you need to actually have a proper moving function shoulder blade with all the muscles working properly, because you have so much different motions even in and around the whole shoulder blade that help with your actual area of that rotator cuff. So it's not just like your arm and your shoulder moving. Your shoulder also consists of your shoulder blade, which is called your scapula. And so as that shoulder blade moves, it actually assists with the whole mobility of that whole shoulder joint. So that becomes a little bit more complex, and we address what those deficits and deficiencies are. And then if there's like tightness in certain areas in the capsule, then we need to address that and do a lot of things to help facilitate that manually. And then exercise is a really important aspect of making sure that we reinforce the mobility gains, and then also just proper specific ones for whatever's going on, like with the tear, to make sure that we're not going too hard too fast if you come in acutely, or doing the appropriate things when you waited a long time and getting you activated.
So if you're having some shoulder pain and you suspect maybe it's a tear, get some expert diagnosis with the experts at Insync Physio. You can reach them and book at insyncphysio.com. They have 2 locations, one in Vancouver. You can also call to book if you want to talk to a human being, 604-566-9716. You can book both clinics online, or you can call the Burnaby office at 604-298-4878. They'll get you back moving well, back climbing again. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Mark.